Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. Thank you, Svea, Jens, for inviting me to be a part of Abstraction today and to share my artwork and research. And thank you all who are in attendance today. For the last 15 years, abstraction has been a central part of my creative practice and research probing the aesthetics of concealment and indeterminacy of photographs in declassified archives, particularly those related to intelligence gathering. And as Svea mentioned in the introduction, growing up in the Washington, D.C. area in the post 9/11 era has really influenced how I view abstraction, particularly in the context of photography. So I'm going to begin here with an image from a project that led me to abstraction. While in graduate school in Washington, D.C., I photographed X Conference, a UFO convention at the National Press Club. And at this time in 2010, I was interested in communities of paranormal researchers and conspiracy theorists and the functions of photographs as evidence and subjects of analysis within those types of groups. In this photograph are members of an organization called the Galactic Federation of Light, who were visiting from Brooklyn, and this is very sort of indicative of the crowd that a conference like this would attract of people from all over the country. Um, and while attending the presentations at the conference, it occurred to me that alleged UFO photographs were often very abstract. They were lacking the clarity and legibility typically expected of photography. And it was their visual ambiguity that left them open to seemingly endless speculation and interpretation. So soon after the conference, as I had been thinking about all of that, I began researching Project Blue Book, which was the Air Force's program that investigated UFO sightings from the late 1940s to the late 1960s in the United States, which I was already somewhat familiar with, just having had this interest in the paranormal research community. And Project Blue Book's declassified files at this time had been housed in the National Archives for, and so being in DC in grad school at this time, that was very accessible to me. And so I was able to request and obtain a copy of a roll of microfilm which contained all of the photographs included in the Project Blue Book investigations. And when I received these images, this roll of microfilm, which at the time was the only um, medium, in which the material could be disseminated to somebody who was requesting this information. Um, and I found that the images were also very abstract, like the other UFO photographs I had seen in circulation. And the high contrast nature of microfilm even further reduced this legibility. Um, the images were black and white to begin with, but they become very stark black and white images when reproduced and transferred to microfilm. So this reproduction had turned the Blue Book photographs into images that possessed, in my thinking, what Adorno calls the unintelligibility of modern art. And this particular frame from the microfilm immediately brought to mind works like Barnett Newman's Canto series and Stations of the Cross series, which were housed at the National Gallery in DC, which I would visit frequently. So these works were also very fresh in my mind as I was encountering the Blue Book images, and I just couldn't help but think of them in terms of this modernist abstraction. So with years of repeated photocopying and transfer to this high contrast microfilm obscuring the Blue Book photographs, they could really no longer function as evidence. They were just too ambiguous. And although Project Blue Book's conclusion was that UFOs, whatever they may actually be, are not an extraterrestrial security, these distorted pictures contrasted that certainty and encouraged speculation and even conspiratorial thinking, right? The ambiguity of these images left themselves open to being appropriated to serve a number of different narrative purposes. And in recent years, we've also seen leaked and declassified videos captured by military aircraft purported to be UFOs or UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. And so these anomalies and the forms in which they're captured as videos or photographs have sort of entered back into a national security context with congressional hearings and revelations about Pentagon programs currently investigating UFOs and UAPs. And like their Blue Book predecessors, um, those images also exhibit indeterminacy. There's a lot of unknowns um, when it comes to even these more recent alleged UFO or UAP photographs in circulation. And a another um, aspect of this sort of imagery conceptually that I was thinking about was looking at these photographs in terms of what the scholar and critic of photography, Lyle Rexer, calls undisclosed photographs. And his book, The Edge of Vision, which I think came out in 2009, so it's still pretty fresh at the time that I was doing this research and making this work. It had a really big impact on my thinking. And so I'll share just a quote from that was very impactful to me. Photography creates objects that have no past or present, even though they solicit precisely an interest in historical circumstances. Our tendency is to make something of the photograph, to try to say immediately what it means and how it works and why it was made. But the images are more disjunctive than that and often frustrate such impulses. Other kinds of art, which of course always solicit us on many levels, never make so insistent a claim, and often deliberately fight against it, resorting to the languages of emotion and direct experience. We are exhorted not to think or interpret, but to think and feel. The photograph can yield non-data, images of something or event rendered completely ambiguous. And so this really resonated with me. It felt directly relevant and applicable to these UFO photographs that I was looking at. Also, historical circumstances with regard to modernist abstraction and the UFO phenomenon that seem to coincide in a meaningful manner. To paraphrase a line from Carl Jung's book on flying saucers, um, the time at which a lot of these photographs were being taken, the height of the UFO phenomenon or panic in the United States in the 50s and 60s also coincides with the ascendancy of abstraction in American art, particularly abstract expressionism. And one of the leading researchers in the UFO community up until he passed a few years ago was Bud Hopkins. And he was an artist who came out of the post-war abstract expressionist scene in New York City. And he had quite an accomplished career as an artist. His work is in the collections of the Whitney, MoMA, the Metropolitan Museum, and um, however, the UFO phenomenon gradually became a primary focus for him after experiencing a sighting in 1964. And he proceeded to sort of dig deeper into this research, gathering accounts from other people who claim to have witnessed UFO sightings or other paranormal or anomalous experiences. And although he did remain an active artist, his work as a UFO researcher really began to take prominence as his career continued into the 70s and 80s and 90s. Um, Circular forms were present in his work before the sighting, as you can see here. This is one from 1963, but they became more prominent even after. So continuing into the late 60s, into the 70s, the circular motif is very pronounced in his work. And perhaps Hopkins' painting became a way for him to grapple with seeing something that he could not fully comprehend, right? Expressing what Donald Cuspit says in The Signs of Psyche in modern and postmodern art is, quote, an implicit disbelief in the traditional ways of understanding, traditional codes of meaning, end quote. So my work with Project Blue Book photographs became my MFA thesis project, the installation shown here. And I ended up scanning and printing the most abstract photographs that I pulled out of the declassified files that I collected to emphasize this relationship I found between them and the unintelligibility of modernist abstraction. Of course, abstract expressionism is known for its large scale, as well as the photographic ambiguity of undisclosed images. This was the beginning of what would kind of define my practice moving forward, researching and appropriating images from government archives that had been rendered indeterminate through reproduction and transformed by circulation and shifting content. And so for the project that I filed Freedom of Information Act request, or FOIA request. As I was researching the Blue Book photographs and drawing parallels to modernist abstraction, I was reminded of an article I'd read by historian and journalist Frances Stoner Saunders, and she also wrote a book called The Cultural Cold War, about the CIA's covert funding of exhibitions featuring American abstract expressionist artists during the Cold War, particularly abroad, to frame the US as a cultural power, championing free expression and artistic individualism in contrast to the perceived rigidity of socialist realism. And so I filed a FOIA request with the CIA asking for photographs and documents pertaining to modern art, as well as the contents of the agency's art collection. Um, at the time, the CIA was only accepting FOIA requests via fax, so I had to fax this to them in December of 2010. And then 2 months later, I received this letter in the mail as a response, so in February of 2011. And you can see here that they acknowledged my request and said, I had permission to receive this information. Um, but they couldn't give me a clear timeline. So they gave me a reference number as well as a phone number to call. So periodically, I would call and check for an update, but nobody ever answers when you call this number. So you leave a message, and then typically the next day I would get a call back from a restricted number from somebody at the CIA's FOIA office, and they would always tell me very politely that there was no status update, and they could not give me a sense of the timeline on when I may receive the files I requested. So this ended up being a very lengthy process, and I'll come back around to this um, later on. But I was able to find some declassified UFO documents proactively released by the CIA, which had been monitoring the UFO phenomenon at the same time as the US Air Force's Project Blue Book. And I incorporated two documents into this project to display with the blown up uh, large scale photographs to contextualize them while also highlighting the photograph's resistance to recognizable content. So this page here is a guide to help photographers take better UFO photographs. Um, and that never seemed to quite work, right? We don't really have um, clear, highly detailed, high resolution images that are irrefutably um, something inexplicable, let alone making the leap to it being extraterrestrial in nature. So, right, so there's something about UFOs that resist photographic uh, clarity and legibility. This other document that I displayed with the work is an information sheet to be filled out by witnesses of UFO sightings. And you can see just before uh, number two says for the camera bug, what was the focal length of the lens given information? A photographic component to that as well. Um, to sort of note these different camera settings or conditions from the photographer who claims to have uh, captured a UFO. After graduate school and kind of finishing the first phase of this project, I expanded my research to include more UFO related documents from the National Security Agency and other government organizations. And in those NSA files in particular, there are just pages and pages that are completely redacted. And they appear to have been photocopied so many times that the redacted fields break down into a static-like image. And so that also resonated with this focus that I had on the abstract nature of the images and documents that I had been collecting. So even though this is most likely redacted text rather than a redacted image, from my understanding, that redacted field is sort of transformed into an abstract image through the reproduction and dissemination of declassified material. So I also reproduced these at large scale and integrated them into that first iteration of this project, of that body of work with the Blue Book photographs and CIA text documents. And I was also finding at this time FBI files pertaining to UFOs that had been proactively released by the Bureau. But again, most of them from this same time period, late 40s, 50s, 60s, um, were highly abstract, again, through repeated photocopying. Um, and I was particularly struck by a few of these photographs in the FBI files that were just labeled as unknown substance, with no other information to give context. So presumably these were materials that were found at the locations of alleged UFO sightings, but again, still they retained that association for me with modernist abstraction, and of course they still came from that same general time period. And then I went back into the Blue Book photographs and also found some photographs that were documentation of unidentifiable objects that were found at the sites of um, places where UFO sightings were alleged to have taken place. So, almost 6 years after filing that FOIA request to the CIA about modern art in the context of their art collection, I received an email from the agency with an update. So they had moved beyond fax and snail mail to contacting via email. And I had moved around a lot during this period, and so I had sent an updated address to receive the information if I was going to receive it, anytime soon. I didn't get an update until this email. They were asking if I was still interested in receiving it, and I replied that I was. And so again, it would take even more time to get results, another few years. So I'll bring this back up again later and share the outcome. So that was in 2016, sort of late 2016. So at the same time that I had been collecting these UFO photographs and working on the that previous project, I was also collecting images from the FBI's National Stolen Art File. Right throughout this process, I had become very familiar with how to access and locate Material that were it was being proactively released by agencies had been declassified either because it was considered no longer relevant to national security, or a certain amount of time had passed that was required in order for something to be released. But one of the databases that was a bit different that I found was the National Stolen Art File, through the FBI. And I had come across that looking through the Bureau's sort of digital vault of declassified information. And the National Stolen Art File is an online database of artworks reported as stolen or lost. Some information regarding artists, title, period, medium, and measurements is given for many of the works listed. However, the photographic documentation for many of the artworks exhibits varying degrees of obfuscation and legibility due to a combination of technical errors, repeated reproduction, digital compression. A lot of the artwork that was stolen, it just has very poor quality documentation to serve as an image in the stolen art file. And oftentimes, one of these distorted photographs is often the only publicly available visual documentation for the stolen artwork. So that also sort of becomes an obstacle, right, for correctly being able to identify some of these lost or stolen works. Some, like in this case, uh, the only available photograph apparently was one of people standing in front of the painting, and then they were cut out of it for anonymity, and I'm also assuming to remove any sort of distraction from what you are actually able to see of the lost or stolen painting. So here's an example of one of the entries in the database that I reproduced at large scale. Now, the National Stolen Art File is accessible as an app that you can download on your phone. You can find it on the App Store. But at the time I was working on the project, I was able to download files directly from the FBI's website. They were still very low resolution, very small files. But I selected images from the art file that seemed to have undergone significant transformation, right, from their original state, and that also had the original dimensions of the artwork listed, so that I knew what size I could reproduce them at, right, to have this kind of one-to-one relationship between the image and the original object. And so I printed the images at the size of the original works, and that would also distort them even further because they were these very tiny compressed image files. And so they became kind of pixelated placeholders for these works that may never be recovered. And they also sort of gave physical form to the accelerating digital mediation, circulation, and consumption of art. So this is a example of one of the instruments that came out of that project. Here's an image from the series, and that I reproduced at its original scale. And you can see here that for the documentation of this painting, the flash is bouncing off the surface of the painting and obscuring the content, and it's listed in the database as unknown painting. So as I was concluding that project, which I called Altered States, I was also, I'm always sort of working on multiple projects at the same time. I'm constantly collecting documents and images from what I can find. Um, and I couldn't really rely a whole lot on the Freedom of Information Act process, just because the things I was requesting were taking forever to get a response on, or in some cases were just being denied. So my attention sort of turned back to a lot of the images I had collected that pertain to photography's use by the military-industrial complex, particularly from the Cold War. While there was a lot of accessible information about this aspect of photography's history, there was also a lot of information that remained secret and underexplored. So this document here was very important in sort of launching that project for me. It's was compiled by the Center for the Study of Intelligence in 1992 and declassified a little over 2 decades later. Um, and it details the development of photo reconnaissance aircraft and operations from the years following the Second World War through the 1970s. And so I began obtaining these sorts of files, mostly from the Air Force, CIA, National Reconnaissance Office, which manages spy satellites, and the National Archives, as I was continuing this research. And many documents were significantly redacted. And it was also common for photographs to have lost detail from reproduction over time, just like the UFO photographs I've been working with. I found two versions of this document. One was released in 2013 on the left, so part of it was still redacted. Then an updated version was released in 2017, which reveals the official location of Area 51, which had been officially classified up until that time, even though it was sort of this open secret. And this is an image I pulled from that document as well of a U-2 spy plane pilot. Um, and the early Cold War was a really pivotal moment in photography's technical and operational development, right, in the context of geopolitical conflict. And the, you know, the major, leap forward in photographic technology for aerial, reconnaissance was the creation of the high altitude U-2 spy plane, right, for clandestine photo reconnaissance over the Soviet Union, for gathering information about its weapon installations. And I see this as kind of one origin point of contemporary issues surrounding the use of photography for surveillance and intelligence gathering. And so my objective in making this work was to piece together a fragmented history through declassified photographs that highlights the tension between informational and ambiguous source material. This image here is a photograph from Area 51, where the U-2 spy plane was being tested. And the original CIA file I found provided no information about what this structure was. But I was really intrigued by it because it looked sort of to me like a monolithic modernist sculpture. But I was able to find out that it was actually a pylon used for aircraft radar testing. So the aircraft would be elevated and then evaluated for its effectiveness in avoiding radar detection. Um, this image here is an example of using scanner manipulation. So moving the printed image on the scanner bed as it's being recorded, and you get these sort of chromatic aberrations and distortions from the movement. And that came out of looking for a way to inject a sense of energy and movement that I felt was missing from photographs like this of high-speed aircraft. And this here shows the supersonic aircraft that was meant to be the successor to the U-2, but was discontinued in favor of satellite imaging. And I also felt that this visual effect created a sense of the image sort of being in a state of transition, of flux, circulating, transforming, and shifting into different contexts through reproduction. And considering this relationship between photography's operational expansion and the proliferation of supersonic aircraft led me to experiment with audio editing software to process images of supersonic aircraft. And so this process visually transforms photographs of subject related to sound by using programs intended for the manipulation of sound. So I import an image as a raw file into an audio editing program, and then I can apply effects like echo or delay to the image file, and then export it back as a raw file that can then be read in a program like Photoshop. And what usually happens is that visual elements are repeated within the photographic image, and that creates an optical analog to auditory echo and vibration. And changes the color and composition of the image to represent the energy of weaponized sound and speed. This is another example of that process of a supersonic reconnaissance drone with a reverb effect applied to the image file. This image here shows the formation of a condensation cloud, which can often coincide with a supersonic aircraft approaching the sound barrier. And this is one of the most abstract results I got from this process, and I kind of thought about it as a visual representation of a sonic boom occurring during transonic flight. And so I mentioned that these sort of experimental supersonic photo reconnaissance aircraft were ultimately put aside in favor of satellite imaging because it was less detectable. The resolution and camera systems had sort of evolved to the point where you could approach taking high definition images or at least larger areas of coverage for targets of interest. And so this collage right here shows the first satellite photograph taken of a Soviet military installation by the Corona satellite, which began um, operation in 1960, 1961, managed jointly by the CIA and US Air Force, and then eventually by the National Reconnaissance Office. This image here is made with photographs taken by the Hexagon satellite system that followed Corona. I combined three declassified hexagon satellite photographs by inserting one image into the red channel, one into the green channel, and one to the blue channel of a blank image file I created in Photoshop to achieve a layering and transparency in a way that emphasized the strong visual elements in each photo. And in the center here of the image, you can see um, a uh, a target on the ground that would have been used to test the resolution of aerial photographic systems. And this collage alludes to the intersecting histories of experimental aircraft and UFO phenomena in the mid-20th century. So sort of bringing that back around to my earlier work and research, the CIA claimed that the U-2 spy plane accounted for more than half of UFO sightings throughout the 50s and 60s. And I suspect experimental aircraft in general continue to account for a lot of UFO sightings today. But here I included an iPhone displaying an alleged UFO film from Project Blue Book to visualize the different modes of display declassified images can now inhabit as they travel from archives into the public sphere. And it's layered on top of other Blue Book photographs as well as photographs of the U-2 and Oxcart aircraft. And this image here um, uses photographs from the FBI's Operation Ghost Stories files, which involved the surveillance of Russian intelligence agents working in the US during the early 2000s. And what you see here in the middle is a Russian agent in New York City appearing to be taking pictures like a tourist as he waits to meet up with a contact. And little does he know that he is photographing in the direction of the FBI agent who is photographing him. So incorporating documents like this was also a way for me to connect the political tensions of the past and the present and recent past back to the Cold War. This is another collage that incorporates another file from that series of documents from Ghost Stories. And combining photographs together and manipulating them with the scanner and collaging them together is also a way for me to kind of represent the sort of physical and digital way that these archival images now exist in simultaneously. But the image on the right there that has secret crossed out, and you can see it says Kodak Royal Paper, is from the Operation Ghost Story files, where a lot of the photographs are redacted, but they also photocopied the backs of the redacted image on the left side, and then the scan or the photocopy of the actual printed image seen on the right side there. So while working on this project, I knew that although, the images would work well as large prints, like my previous work, I also wanted it to be experienced as a book. I felt that the book form made sense for a few reasons. It would be an opportunity to contextualize the work I was writing. The images could be deliberately sequenced for a sort of montage-like effect. And the format recalled the booklets and manuals full of documents that I had encountered in my research. So this is a illustration of the book cover. This would be in 2021 when it came out. And I worked closely with a publisher, Daylight Books, on this that had approached me to work with them after seeing some work from this project. Um, and you can see here that um, the creative director and I took inspiration from the Defense Intelligence Agency's style manual for inspiration for the cover. Um, Get the title viewing distance because it took on a few meanings for me, right? The term refers to the optimum space between viewer and image based on the image's resolution, but also the distance between subject and camera, as well as the spatial and temporal distance from history and the images that inform or complicate our picture of it. So there's the final form of the finished book. And, this was also a great opportunity to insert some of the redacted documents I'd collected amongst the actual artworks in the book. So there's an example of a couple of those that I worked in um, there. And then I think this one is particularly interesting. It's from the National Reconnaissance Office. As you can see, it's mostly redacted, but it speaks to the continued importance of photographic technology in the operations of U.S. national security. The document itself is from 2010, it was released in 2017, but the unredacted part reads, well, redacted, the benefit of high resolution imagery. While we can solve many intelligence problems using medium resolution imagery, we simply cannot resolve others without the benefit of high resolution collection. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency analysts and scientists team with National Reconnaissance Office experts to achieve information dominance over current and potential adversaries that significantly contributes to our combat edge. And you can see that these redactions here are categorized, right, as B1 and B3. Those can be categories that refer to confidential human intelligence sources, relationship with intelligence sources, or a foreign government, as well as any information that would impair US cryptologic systems or activities. So I received my FOIA response in 2021, finally, after 10 years. Um, and so while they were able to honor my request, much of what I had asked for was redacted, specifically the contents of the CI's abstract art collection, which was gifted to them by the estate of a Washington, D.C. art collector, Vincent Melzak. And you can see that's a B4 redaction, which refers to trade secrets and commercial or financial information obtained from a person that is privileged or confidential. But also at the same time, though, the names of the artists, the artwork titles, the dates of creation are listed for each painting. The values of the paintings at the time they were first loaned to the CIA are also listed. And presumably, this is owned by a government institution. You would think that these works would be publicly accessible, right, in terms of their photographic documentation. So although it took 10 years, I was glad that these documents sort of arrived when they did because I was able to see them in the context of my current research. And I realized that the redacted photographs of paintings in the CIA's collection are examples of what I come to think of as deep photography. And that term borrows from the political scientist Peter Dale Scott's concept of deep politics, which is, to quote him, all those political practices and arrangements, deliberate or not, which are usually repressed rather than acknowledged. And so deep photography encompasses classified photographs captured as part of covert activities and any other photographs that government agencies keep secret. And, I think you could classify a lot of the images I work with as sort of deep photography having risen to the surface, right? So that you know, information from this FOIA request didn't work its way directly into my subsequent project, but it certainly influenced my thinking about images that remain redacted or that were once redacted and have become accessible in one form or another. So that's really central to my new book, Critical Collection, which is coming out right now. Um, and I really wanted to focus further on the development and advancement of spy satellites, which produced the most highly classified form of deep photography. And so the KH-11 Canon satellite, the image of which is redacted here, is the first satellite to use electro-optical imaging for near real-time photo reconnaissance. It's been active since 1976 and has been upgraded, but its capabilities remain classified. So again, thinking about this idea of deep photography rising to the surface, I was working with images taken by U-2 spy planes. So this missile site during the Cuban Missile Crisis, taken by a U-2 spy plane. The image was glitched partially when I found it, and I sort of exaggerated that further through data bending. Again, working with a layering process where I'm combining maps showing areas of coverage for satellite systems. But photographic reconnaissance is only one way that images have been instrumentalized to further the US's imperial objectives and maintain global dominance. And as I mentioned earlier, beginning in the early Cold War, the CIA and State Department worked with cultural institutions to internationally promote American modern art, combating the perception abroad of the US as militaristic and Philistine. So I began combining images of uh, photo reconnaissance aircraft or satellite systems with photographs from the National Archives of artworks that were being displayed in these exhibitions that were being coordinated by the State Department with the assistance of MoMA as well. So here I have a de Kooning painting combined with the U-2 spy plane. This is a camera schematic combined with an Arshil Gorky painting. Another camera schematic from the Corona satellite with a William Bassiotes painting. So these artworks would have been displayed in an exhibition in Paris in 1955 called 50 Years of U.S. Art. Here's one more where the hand that's holding a photograph is showing an F-117 Nighthawk stealth aircraft, and it's when the Assistant Secretary of Defense, J. Daniel Howard, unveiled an image of one for the first time in 1998, although it had been classified for 7 years already at that time. The background is a Mark Rothko painting that was included in that 50 Years of U.S. Art exhibition. So juxtaposing American hard and soft power, right, in that way through this particular group of images. And then also the U.S. Information Agency, which was a propaganda organization, was funding photographic exhibitions like the Family of Man. So here's a photo I found during my research at the National Archives of then Vice President Nixon and Edward Steichen at the Washington, D.C. opening of the Family of Man exhibition. And I recreated a poster design from the Family of Man for the outside of the composition. This photograph in the middle of the composition here is from the Family of Man exhibition staged in Paris. And combined with an aerial photograph taken by a former military photographer, William Garnett, who was also included in the Family of Man exhibition, and a sort of nod to Kodak here because they it can be thought of as in terms of the film as both an artistic medium and a tool of the military industrial complex, right? Kodak was creating a special film for the U-2 camera systems, developed a lot of the photographs that were taken from covert reconnaissance missions, um, and remained a contractor for the U.S. government as it pursued photo reconnaissance satellite systems. And just sort of moving towards the end here, I continued with taking some inspiration from some propaganda posters I was seeing that from the National Archives, from initiatives from the U.S. Information Agency. So for this one, combining images taken by a camera system called a Tactical Airborne Reconnaissance Pod System and arranging them in a design that I recreated from a propaganda poster that had been disseminated in the Middle East during the Cold War by the USIA. But these images are from Desert Storm in Iraq. There's a example of a spread from the book, sort of combining two of those images together. And I also continued with experimenting with audio software to process images, but I've expanded a bit, not just to supersonic aircraft, but images also pertaining to signal intelligence. right? So still within that realm of images that represent something related to sound. So this is an aerial photograph of the Defense Satellite Communication Systems Operations Center, a sort of signal intelligence station at Fort Meade, where the National uh, Security Agency is also located. A signal intelligence drone, the MQ-4C Triton, and then a fairly recent image that was released by the U.S. In spring of 2023 during the conflict in Ukraine. This is from an MQ-9 Reaper drone from the U.S. Almost colliding with a Russian Su-27 over the Black Sea. And so again, we're seeing some of these conditions play out that we can connect back to the Cold War. And while my work has incorporated more representational elements in recent years, as you can see, they're always contrasted by redaction and the aesthetics of negation. And what we're allowed to know and see is often incomplete and indeterminate. And the traces of photographs and imaging systems that are unseen and inaccessible at a time when a seemingly infinite stream of photographic images is at one's fingertips are reminders not only of the deep political system's regulation of knowledge and vision, but the clandestine governmental operations of the past and present. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much.